Good evening. I'm happy to introduce our speaker tonight is Nathan Senner. He's from the University of Massachusetts at Amherst. Nathan started studying birds at the age of 14, and after college, he was awarded a Thomas J. Watson Fellowship to follow Hudsonian godwits on their annual migration from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America and back, which sounds like an amazing trip. I wish I had been a fly on the wall. It sounds great. He then researched he got his PhD at Cornell University, and then another postdoc in Europe studying the flexibility of black-tailed godwit annual cycles. So another interesting thing to study. Then in Montana, he investigated the population dynamics of high elevation deer mice. I love this. It's a very interesting life. Presently, he's in the Department of Environmental Conservation at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. That's since 2022. His lab mostly focuses on the population and movement ecology of long-distance migratory birds. And recently, he became, it's a mouthful, but it's right there, it's on the screen. He became the Massachusetts Audubon Bertrand Chair for Ornithology, also at the University of Massachusetts. So it sounds like he's had a great life. And I'm happy to introduce our speaker, Nathan Senner.
All right. Well, yeah, great to be here with you all. And yeah, I want to talk to you tonight about, for the most part, long distance shorebird migration. And where I want to start, once it lets me start now. All right. I want to start from a place of hope. And I'm glad this video is playing. I want to start from a place of hope because this is just an amazing place and an amazing spectacle. This is DeVoe Bank. It's a tiny little sandbar that is off the shore of Kiowa Island in South Carolina. And Kiowa, I don't know if, has anybody been to Kiowa? It's like one of the biggest resort islands, right, in all of South Carolina. Golf courses, high-rise apartments. But this little sandbar actually remained largely unknown until a few years ago when my colleague Felicia Sanders was on a boat just off the shore of the sandbar one morning, and she saw this. And it was tens of thousands of whimbrel taking off. And what we've since learned is that it's in fact 20,000 whimbrel, which is half of the entire Atlantic flyway population that all comes to spend the night on this tiny little spot. So the fact that it could remain unknown in a place that's so well known gives me hope that there are other such places in the world that we might yet discover that hold secrets about birds and their biology that will change how we think about the world. But it also shows that spectacles, right, can still exist and amaze us. And I love watching this video. I have seen this video thousands of times, but it still gets me. So that's the note I want to start you on, because a lot of the rest of the notes that we're going to talk about are not quite as good. So long-distance migratory shorebirds as a group are in dramatic decline. Since the 1970s, the suite of 19 species that we sort of lump into this group, the populations have declined by over 50%. Some of them have declined by more than 90%. And so we need to have that hope to keep our spirits up while we think about these more pressing questions. And what I try to do in my lab is to understand those declines by asking two deceptively simple questions. So the first is, what is it that allows some species to respond to environmental change? And secondly, what is it that makes others vulnerable to declines and extinctions? And I'm sure lots of people have asked those same questions, but we're still in the situation that we're at today. And so I think it's useful to continue to ask them, to try to push forward. And in my mind, though, what we need to be doing to answer these questions is to try to connect information about the individual lives of birds with those that happen across different populations and different species. And it's only by integrating sort of across these three biological levels of organization that we're actually really going to be able to identify sort of the actions that will best help to avert further declines. So in my research group at UMass, we do this, by and large, by putting little devices like this one on the backs of shorebirds. We'll call this one a satellite transmitter, but it could be any number of other devices. And this allows us to follow individual birds over the course of their entire lives. So we can really get an in-depth sort of image of what they're doing on a daily basis. And we then work to couple these tracking device studies with things that we can do on the ground, where we can measure things like resource abundance. We can actually also observe the birds that we've put these tracking devices on to figure out when and where they might be dying or how successfully they might breed. Then we can go up in the air and we can use things like remote sensing to observe global scale environmental processes. And finally, we can work with community scientists the world over to try to develop information about population trends. And all of this then in service of identifying actions that are going to help conserve shorebirds. So with these tracking devices over the past 6 years or so, my lab has covered most of the Western Hemisphere with tracks of birds. I'm particularly proud of the ones that go right down here to the Falkland Islands that we got lucky enough to observe a few years back from the coast of Brazil. So what I'm going to do tonight is to tell you about 3 vignettes about how we can turn information that we gather from tracking devices into actual conservation actions. And those 3 vignettes are going to cover things that we can learn at really hemispheric scales down to things that we can learn at really local scales. So let's start at that hemispheric scale. And to do that, I want to talk a bit about Hudsonian godwits. As Candy mentioned, what really launched my own scientific career was a fellowship that allowed me on foot to follow Hudsonian godwits. And basically my conclusion at the end of that year was, man, I wish we had something that we could just put on a bird so we could follow it. And well, about 15 years later, we finally did. And so work that my PhD student Jennifer Linscott has been leading has tracked godwits on their epic migrations from southern South America up to the Arctic of, well, subarctic of Alaska. And if you can't see from this image, what's really remarkable about godwit migrations is that they're traversing the Pacific Basin, and they do so without stopping. So these birds are flying on average about 7 days and 10,000 to 11,000 kilometers, all of that spent flapping, no food, no water, no sleep, so far as we know. And what we've come to appreciate is that things that are happening at these hemispheric scales can have really impactful consequences for individual birds. That sounds maybe like a no duh kind of thing, but birds, of course, aren't necessarily experiencing hemispheric scale processes. They're experiencing ones that sort of exist in and of themselves. But the way to best observe sort of how these hemispheric scale processes work is to hone in on this section right here, which is the prairie pothole region of the Dakotas, and happens to be where every Hudsonian godwit stops on its way north. No matter where it winds up going, ultimately, it stops in the prairie potholes. And what they're doing there is they're finding small agricultural wetlands where they can put down for maybe only a few hours, sometimes a couple of days. And if you look at the tracks, these 3 lines all come from a single individual that we dubbed KCL, really poetic name. And what I want you to notice, though, about these tracks is each of those is a separate year that it flew north. And all those clusters of dots are actually where it stopped on the ground. And you might see that they actually don't overlap with each other, right? This bird is stopping in a different place each and every year. And what that means is it needs to find a new place to stop each and every year. And these small agricultural wetlands, though, they pop on and off the map over the course of a spring, meaning that you can't say, I know where I'm going to go. This bird has to sort of find those spots anew. And so in years when there's not much water, that means there aren't many of these agricultural wetlands, and that means godwits have a hard time finding a place to stop. So this is that bird, KCL, in 1 year. And the way to look at this map is it's coming in from the south, and you follow this line northwards, and it gets to this spot where it appears to really want to stop. Maybe it thought it could stop there from a past year, but it can't. And so then it winds up flying a whole 65 or so more kilometers before it finds this place to stop. Now, I like to run marathons, and if you told me at the end of a marathon that I needed to go run another couple miles to find the right food, I'd be like, oh, hell no. Like, I just did that. This bird just flew from southern Chile 10,000 plus kilometers, and now we're making it fly another 65 kilometers to find a place to stop. So unfortunately, in these dry years, what we found is that that really negatively influences the survival of adult godwits. In fact, they survive 25% less well during dry years than wet years. And if you know anything about sort of population dynamics, if you destabilize a population like that by taking 25% of the adults, that's not a good thing. And in fact, godwits as a species are thought to be declining, to have declined by about 95% over the past 50 years. So remember I told you there's going to be some really heartwarming stories here over the rest of the evening. So that's how we start to understand these hemispheric scale processes, like where water is, how weather patterns are occurring. Let's then start to narrow in on regional scale processes. And for that, we're going to turn to the Wimbrel. Showed you DeVoe Bank. And this is work that is sort of focused on DeVoe Bank and led by my PhD student, Mena Handmaker. And where godwits are incredibly flexible in finding a new place to stop each and every year, Wimbrel seem to know what they like. They like DeVoe Bank. They like the coast of South Carolina. And we can see that right here, right? All of these tracks come together at that one spot. And within that one spot, they do this. They all stop at DeVoe Bank in the night, and then they head out into surrounding salt marshes during the day to feed. And this is the very first bird that we tracked from South Carolina. And when we saw this track, we're like, all right, we know what we're gonna do, right? This bird, it goes back and forth to that same spot each and every day. We thought, we know this. We can conserve DeVoe Bank and we can go to this spot on the mainland. And then, we started tracking some more birds, and this is what we found. In fact, each and every individual Wimbrel goes to a different place, and it goes back to that same place each and every day. And it then goes back to that same place each and every year. In fact, they're going to within 50 meters or 100 meters. Their home range just stays that same spot. And in fact, some of these same birds come back through in the fall. There aren't nearly as many. But even when there aren't as many other ones around, they still go to that same spot. So that second home is a really crucial component of their time spent in South Carolina. So it then also means, though, that we need to approach conservation in South Carolina thinking about two really different scales, right? We need to conserve this one tiny sandbar, but then we also need to conserve this really vast expanse of salt marsh that covers much of the state. All right, the third vignette I want to talk to you about is with red knots on the Pacific coast of Northwest Mexico and how we think about movements of birds at really fine spatial scales. And this is work led by my PhD student, Julian Garcia Walter. And he's been tracking red knots that breed up in either the eastern Siberian Arctic or western Alaska and then migrate down to the Pacific coast of Baja California in Northwest Mexico. And there he's focused on one particular site called Guerrero Negro. You can see it right here. And what he has had is these tracking devices that give us location estimates from each bird every 15 minutes. And so he can really then start to identify their behaviors based on different properties of the data that he's getting back. So this is a map of a single bird moving around Guerrero Negro, and each of those colors is a different behavior. So those red places are where it spends the high tide time roosting. Those orange yellow dots are where it's foraging, and the blue dots are it commuting between its foraging and roosting sites. Julian then teamed up, though, with some oceanographers to figure out what sea level rise is going to look like in Guerrero Negro over the next decade, next 3 decades, or the next 70 or 80 years. What he found is, unfortunately, by 2100, at low tide, when these birds are foraging, they're going to lose 40 to 60% of all of their foraging habitat. And then, though, at high tide, they're going to lose 98 to 100% of all of their known roost sites, all to sea level rise and the fact that the marsh just can't rise fast enough to accommodate the rising sea levels. And he then projected out across the entirety of their non-breeding range and found that around Northwest Mexico, red knots are likely to lose 55% of all of their current habitat extent. So, another rosy outlook. But what I've told you about is, okay, thought about individuals and maybe some populations. How do we get to the species level, and then how do we turn this into action? So to get to that species level, I have teamed up with colleagues in South America, Fernando Angulo, Geraldo Norambuena, and their organizations in Peru and Chile called Corbidi, and actually the Rock. It's not Rochester, it's the Red de Observadores de Aves Chile. And with their help, and more recently, a postdoc of mine, Fernando Faria, and organizations across the rest of Southern South America, we have been able to recruit community scientists to go out and simultaneously survey literally every single coastal wetland across the coasts of Ecuador, Peru, Chile, Argentina, Uruguay, and southern and central Brazil. So this is 1,000 people going out and surveying thousands of sites. And from this, we've been able to generate really robust population size estimates for the suite of shorebird species that spend either their breeding season, like the bird on the far left there, the Magellanic oystercatcher, or their non-breeding seasons, like Hudsonian godwits, and this is the Rufa redknot that you might see here in New York. So we found, for instance, that the population of Rufa redknots that is now spending the winter in Southern South America has dwindled to only 6,500 individuals. So this allows us to sort of, I showed you that population trend estimate slide at the very beginning. Those were just sort of indices of how many birds there used to seem to be and how many there seem to be now. And what we've added is actual numbers to say, in fact, in some of these cases, there are very, very few birds. Okay, so now we have an idea what's happening at the species level 2. Where do we go from here? Well, we try to connect each of the projects that we're working on with on-the-ground conservation action. So we're now working in the mid-continent to try to work with farmers to identify how we get water on the landscape. Not so much that it's necessarily in a predictable spot so that birds can go back from year to year, but that there are enough of those wetlands in any one year that they don't have to spend too much time searching. We've worked with folks at the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, the state of South Carolina, and others to try to protect barrier islands in South Carolina for whimbrel. And then for red knots, we're actually starting to experimentally create what are called floating mats, where birds actually can roost at the highest of high tides. So hopefully providing sort of emergency roost site habitat during the times when otherwise everything else would be gone. But I want to tell you just a bit more about what's been going on in South Carolina, because I think it brings us back into the more heartening side of things. So after not really knowing that DeVoe Bank even existed, to then knowing that it existed and not necessarily wanting to do anything, literally this week, we've had an incredible breakthrough where the state of South Carolina has passed legislation that now permanently protects DeVoe Bank so that nobody can be on the island from the months of March through the months of October, which encompass all of the times that whimbrel are passing through the area. And what really triggered this action was a whole lot of positive attention to this discovery that Felicia and our research team made. So led to stories on CBS Sunday Morning, the television show, in the New York Times. But then actually, I think the most important and consequential pieces of news came out in Charleston Magazine and Garden and Gun, because those are the things that people actually in South Carolina read and pay attention to. So that led to a local senator actually campaigning to increase protection at DeVoe Bank, and then local communities coming together to agree to try to preserve the area, and then finally, the state Senate just on Monday agreeing to protect it by law. So action can happen, but it requires this, I think, really in-depth knowledge about individual birds that we can scale up to understand these species level processes. And then it also involves making connections to groups like yours and to groups of people who may not otherwise know that they care about birds. So then, what's next for us? We've covered a lot of the Western Hemisphere, but there's actually one place that we haven't covered at all, and that's Massachusetts. Across all these birds that we've been tracking, only a measly 3 have flown over the state that now pays my salary. So we're going to try to start changing that. And we're going to focus on 2 species that spend a whole lot of time together, actually. That's the willet and the whimbrel. And they don't just spend time together in Massachusetts, where you can see them in salt marshes, but throughout much of the rest of the year as well. So these are two eBird maps for these species during the non-breeding season in South America. And I challenge anyone here, including some folks from eBird, to try to tell me which one of these is the range map for willet and which one is the range map for whimbrel. Anybody want to hazard a guess? They're really, yeah, I don't even remember until I click through the slides. So on the right here is the willet map, and on the left is the whimbrel map. So they are co-occurring a whole lot of the time. And that's important because they're unfortunately exhibiting really different population trends. So whimbrel are one of those species that's really rapidly declining. The Atlantic flyway population, we think 78% decline since 1975. But willet are the one long-distance migratory shorebird species whose population is not declining, growing by an estimated 15%. And that's even more remarkable if you know something about what willet have gone through. So as of mid-1970s, they had been extirpated from the state of Massachusetts. No birds bred there, even though they had previously bred there in the late 19th century and very early 20th century. But if you go to, say, one of the lovely Mass Audubon wildlife sanctuaries on the coast of Massachusetts in the spring or summer, this is likely going to be a pretty common sight for you. Willet screaming its head off at you because you're either somewhere too close to its nest or you're too close to its chicks. And that's a really great thing. And here's just sort of a figure to show you how dramatic this turnaround has been. When Mass Audubon did a breeding bird atlas in the mid-1970s, they found willet nesting in 4 of their atlas blocks. In the mid-2000s, we're up to 98, and I know it's grown even since then. So willet are doing surprisingly well, while whimbrel, their buddies, are decidedly not. And so what we're going to try to do is to understand what it is about willet that makes them resilient to the threats that we know coastal shorebirds are facing, like sea level rise, like dogs. I've got a dog, but I don't let dogs chase shorebirds like this. And of course, urban encroachment. So we hope that by learning what makes willet resilient to all of these threats, we can then better understand how to help conserve species like whimbrel that are not doing so well. So that is part of the plan, part 1. The other part of the plan actually involves me branching out and getting out of my comfort zone because other birds migrate as well. And some of these same sort of processes that we've been working on in shorebirds, I think will translate well to other species of migratory birds too. And so I don't know if any of you know what Mass Audubon's logo looks like, but it looks like this. Any guess about what species that is? It's a tern, absolutely. Sorry, it is not a royal tern. It's a roseate tern, one of 2 endangered species that breeds in Massachusetts. And Mass Audubon has a long history of collaboration and sort of ownership over their flagship species. So John Herbert is the current bird conservation director, and Joan Walsh was actually my predecessor as the Bertrand chair. And they've both been working with roseate terns along with the rest of this team from National Audubon Society and the University of Rhode Island for the past 30 or so years. And so they've gotten this off the ground, but what they're just now starting to do is to track roseate terns. And so we're hoping to be able to understand roseate tern movements, to be able to project how they're going to deal with a number of changes that are headed their way in the future. Because with all these movements, these are all individual roseate terns. You might notice there's this big sort of ugly blob there in the lower right-hand corner of this map, and that's proposed and in process offshore wind farms. So much of this region here, Long Island Sound and off of Block Island, is going to be covered in the near future, although certain political winds suggest maybe not so fast, by these kinds of wind turbines. And we know from other species of terns in Europe that terns can be really strongly affected by these offshore wind farms. So sandwich terns in the Netherlands, we found largely fly to avoid these offshore wind farms. And that shift in their movement patterns can have energetic consequences in terms of actually having to fly more distance, but it can also shift where it is that they actually try to feed. And some of those areas where offshore wind farms are being placed are actually high quality foraging areas. They've also found that the more densely packed the wind turbines are in these wind farms, the more likely birds are to avoid them. So we want to understand whether similar processes are at work for roseate terns, because not only are those wind farms likely to be built in Long Island Sound, but along the entirety of the migration path for roseate terns from their breeding areas in Massachusetts and New York and Maine down to the northern coast of South America. So these are all projected or currently in process wind farms along the Atlantic coast. And then they're facing similar obstacles along much of the coast of Brazil. And these ones in Brazil haven't been built yet, but these are tracking data of the daily foraging commutes of individual roseate terns from the coast out to where they feed offshore. And each of those purple squares is a proposed offshore wind farm. So they're going to have to either traverse or completely go around all of these farms in the near future. So what we're going to do is we're going to use these maps of where wind farms are likely to be superimposed on all of our tracking data to develop a sort of a risk assessment for how risky each tern's life might be in the near future. And then we can put that into what's called a population viability analysis, where we can say, if you build no wind farms, this might be the projection for the population size of terns going into the future. Maybe if you build one wind farm in a not so bad place, it could look like this. But maybe if you build all the wind farms, this is what we're going to see. And currently, the breeding population of roseate terns in the United States is somewhere just south of 10,000 pairs. So that's not a lot to be able to withstand, say, some of these negative consequences. So we're going to then be able to go to the US Fish and Wildlife Service and other entities that are making decisions about the placement of these wind farms and say, here are sort of your likely scenarios, and here are the best decisions that you could be making if you have terns in your mind. They may not, but we'd like to think that they will. Okay. So I hope that what I have sort of convinced you of is that tracking data is a multifaceted tool, but it also can be used to tell really compelling stories. So I'm just going to make a little plug that if you like these kinds of stories, on my lab's website, there are more of them. So this is a story map that my student Mana Handmaker made, telling you about what individual whimbrel encounter along their migration routes. But there are also great videos done by colleagues at Cornell about DeVoe Bank, for instance, but also about Hudsonian godwits and other cool species. What I want to leave you with, though, are some things that I think that we all can do to help shorebirds to some degree in our daily lives, but certainly with not too much more effort than we might normally put out. So the first is, yes, let's minimize disturbance along our beaches. The shores of your fair lake right here are a great migratory pathway, and increasing the energetic output that these birds have to make to avoid whether it's a small child or your dog are really consequential during their migratory movements. Second is contributing and recognizing that science communication, because science communication, in fact, works. So piping plovers and Wilson's plovers, like in the photo here, have really benefited from beach closures, but not just the signage, the fact that people go out and volunteer on these beaches to tell other folks about the birds that are nesting there. And that can have a real impact for the relationships between communities and local conservation efforts. Because a lot of people initially are like, wait, I can't use this beach because of this little bird. But having someone out there who can be a face of that conservation effort can really have a positive impact. Maybe the one that's slightly harder, but I don't know how many of y'all maybe own land, But water on the landscape is not just a thing, not just an important thing in the mid-continent of the US. These are all photos taken by, I don't know if anybody in the audience took one of these, but these are all from here around Rochester. These are all temporary wetlands in agricultural fields with shorebirds that we're seeing there. So shorebirds here aren't just stopping on the lakeshore. They're also, a lot of the time, stopping in these ephemeral agricultural habitats here too. And I know in Massachusetts, where we are along the Connecticut River, it's always the ag wetlands. So finding ways to work with local landowners to actually get water on the landscape during the times of the year that shorebirds are passing over can be hugely consequential. Next, I urge everyone to become a community scientist. There are, of course, incredible things like eBird that make use of all of the data that we put in to really project out trends and help guide conservation actions. But there are other programs. This is bandedbirds.org, that if you see a bird with color markers or any other kind of marking, you can actually report that to here. And I get like pings from them. Well, I wish it was every couple of weeks, more like every couple of months when somebody's seen one of our birds. So it's really important data that we couldn't be out in all of those places ourselves, actually watching for banded birds. And lastly, I'll say this. I don't want to make this a political talk, but I know that actually, in fact, the roseate tern work that I just described to you has been put on hold because the government is potentially going to cut that grant because it's no longer in their purview. I have another grant that is likely not to be renewed because of changing priorities. Science at the moment and funding for science is not in a good spot. But it's something that if we are voicing to people in the right places is important to us and has economic benefits beyond just employing lucky people like me, can really help start swaying some minds. So I urge you, if you're willing in your own way, to find a place to raise that voice and to speak up for science, because I think it can really be impactful. All right, so with that, I'll just leave you with a couple of take-home points. First, despite lots and lots of work, the drivers of migratory bird population declines in many cases remain maddeningly unclear. And so we do actually need to continue being out there doing more science to learn more. And I think the way to do that is linking individual level processes with species level dynamics so that we can point the way towards targeted conservation actions. And I think the key on top of that, once we've done the science, though, is telling stories so that people who are not scientists understand what's going on and what they can do to help conserve birds. And with that information, then, I think that we all have a role to play, and I hope you all can join in. So just want to thank many funders, and especially the folks in my lab. I tried to show pictures of the graduate students who were leading the work I told you about this evening, but there are many others who are all doing super cool work, and they are the real people that are on the ground making all of this happen. I just get to come and, talk to folks like you and tell stories about it. So thank you all very much. I'm happy to answer any questions if anyone has any. Yes.
What are we talking about that you need to know? What's your level of funding, 50,000, 500,000, what is it?
That particular one is.
Can I ask you to repeat the question?
Oh, absolutely, yes.
You didn't have the mic over here, so
Yep.
people on team.
Yeah, the question was, when we talk about grants, how much are we talking about? Well, the particular one for roseate terns is $288,000, $288,787. That is for 2 years. We have others that are up to a couple $1 million. So these are not small amounts of money, but if you think about all of the people they support, all of the work they support and the impacts that work can have, I like to think that it's a good investment. So that particular grant would support a postdoctoral fellow and a graduate student over the course of those 2 years, as well as buying some more transmitters to continue to follow roseate terns.
I have a simple question.
All right.
We occasionally see a Hudsonian godwit here in the fall, presumably migrating south. Are they just strays, or could they be a more easterly migrating pathway?
That's a great question. So the question is, are the Hudsonian godwits that you see passing through here, where are they coming from? They are most likely birds that are breeding on the west shore of Hudson Bay, so up in northern Ontario, Manitoba, and Nunavut. So that's actually the largest of the breeding populations, and they're headed to the coasts of Argentina and Tierra del Fuego at the very, very southern tip of South America.
You want to talk about the age composition of those?
Yeah, most of the ones, the question was, what is the age composition of the godwits that are stopping here? Most of those birds are juveniles, so on their first migration southwards. And what's incredible about not just godwits, but pretty much all shorebirds is that young birds are making that trek all alone, which is why we tend to see more of them in places that you don't see other godwits. But that's pretty crazy because it's about 10 weeks from when they first hatched, when they're flying south. And yeah, that flight south is, in this case, going to involve a hop from, say, Cape Cod out over the Atlantic all the way into the Amazon basin. So a good 5 days and 8,000 kilometers nonstop, which no one's telling them, so to speak, how to do it. So maybe it's not so surprising that some of them are like, the lakeshore looks pretty good. I think I'll stop there for a while. Nope.
I have a question. So there was I forget which bird it is, I apologize, the ones that was going through the plains?
Uh-huh.
And you said
Also godwits.
they were looking for water sources?
Yep.
Are you also looking at food sources to see what, do they have enough food and water? And is there any impact on the agriculture affecting their amount of food that is there?
That is an excellent question. Should I repeat that for online or? No, we got it. All right. Yeah. So they're feeding on largely small invertebrates that are just in the soil. And so lots of worms, small clams, freshwater clams. But there are starting to be hints that this new suite of pesticides that you may have heard of, neonicotinoid pesticides, that's always a mouthful, are especially bad for some of those kinds of food sources, and that they then start to accumulate in the shorebirds. So we haven't yet found any effects for godwits, but I know folks who are investigating that in lesser yellowlegs, which are in exactly the same wetlands as the godwits are. And they're starting to find worrying levels, although they then haven't identified that it actually has performance consequences. They don't know if it's like messing with their ability to take on fat or any of those things. But it is worrying that we're seeing those signatures after really a stretch where there was really strong efforts to limit the kinds of pesticides that were being used. And that has, this new class is sort of switching that dynamic.
This has to do with your lecture that you're giving tonight. Have you done this lecture at all in the Midwest?
I have. I have been out to the Dakotas, and I've met with farmers there. And, you have to, of course, tailor it to the audience that I'm talking to, but people there want to see birds in their landscape as well. The key, right, is to figure out what are the economic costs for them of things like water on the landscape that are the things that birds need. And so that's why we're trying to work to develop an economically viable way to get water on the landscape, because it actually does have really clear costs for farmers. If there's that water there, they can't plant their crops in it, or they can't access it if they have planted their crops. So there has to be a mitigation of that economic cost for the farmers.
Well, you took a different fork in the road to answer the question. Let me give you more information. My brother is president of the Chequamegon chapter of the Audubon Society, which is in the northernmost part of Wisconsin, way up on Lake Superior. And there's a consortium of these clubs in the Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio, Indiana that are now communicating with each other, and they're sharing speakers like yourself.
All
And
right.
I don't know if my brother's on this tonight, but I didn't know if you
Hi.
if you knew of this consortium, which
No.
this would be a fabulous talk for those clubs to know that, on Zoom they could see this, because you do have a Midwest focus with a number of the flyways.
Well, please pass the word along to your brother if he's not on. I would be happy to give a talk to them as well.
So on a practical note, if you would like us to advocate for some of your grants that are in danger, if you want to like email us some names of grants or and
No.
who we should
It
talk,
doesn't
who
have
we
to
should
be
talk
about
to.
just me, but I think talking to any representative at the moment at the federal level and making clear that, yeah, science is important from a conservation standpoint, from an economic standpoint. It definitely doesn't
But
have to
I'd
be
like
about
to
my
get a
grant.
little bit more specific. I don't know.
I can tell you the names of the grants. I can definitely write that in an email.
I'm a retired civil engineer, and listening to your discussion about prairie potholes and things like that, are you people talking at all to all of the government organizations that basically work with developers, highways, everybody else on stormwater ponds? Because there's tons of both temporary ones that are built and also permanent ones.
Yeah.
And I know, going through civil engineering and working on a lot of projects, there is almost no discussion on the value of those related to ecosystems.
Yeah.
So there's starting to be some, but the focus is still just on stormwater, infiltrating water, things
Right,
like that.
right.
There's only a little bit of focus on when would be good times to actually be storing water for migratory birds or other things, what to plant in them for those. So I'm just thinking that that's like a whole avenue
Yeah.
that reaches into every subdivision, every development, every highway.
Yeah.
Is just out there, and then the civil engineering community to a large extent is really like unaware that they could do a lot of things.
That is a great idea. I will admit that I have not thought about those, but yes, you see them everywhere. So they are ubiquitous. If I'll get your name afterwards, and if there are like particular like trade association groups or something that we might be able to get in touch with in the Dakotas or that region, I'd love to know about it.
Yeah, I don't know about the Dakotas, but in general, the soil and water conservation
Okay.
services,
Yep.
the DOTs.
Yeah.
If you can get into the DOTs, if you can get into the people who approve the stormwater plans for contractors, which is every county has a group that does that.
Okay.
Pretty much every state government. You get in there, many people will do something. They just have no idea what to do.
Yeah. That's a great idea. Thank you very much.
Other questions? Any online? No more. Okay, well, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Do you have any hypotheses as for why the willet and the whimbrel have opposite population trajectories, even though they share the same or ostensibly the same ecosystem?
Yeah. So there are two. The one that is sort of less satisfying to me maybe is that whimbrel are Arctic breeders. So a lot of them are on just where the godwits are on the shore of Hudson Bay, places like that. And the Arctic is changing more rapidly than other regions climatically. And so there's, for a lot of those species now, what we call a mismatch between when the resources become available for their young after they hatch and when those birds are actually reproducing. So that's one possibility. Whereas, yeah, the willet are breeding right in Massachusetts and in temperate areas where the conditions aren't changing quite as fast. That's a hard thing to change, right? Like, I would like to stop climate change, but that we got to, work in a piecemeal fashion. So that I'm sort of hoping, insofar as we hope these things, that that's not the answer. And the other possibility in my mind really has to do with how the two species respond to disturbance. So whimbrel are pretty big, heavy birds. And some folks have done some experiments with different shorebird species and how quickly they take off from the ground in the face of disturbance. And whimbrel are the first ones to take off, i.e. from the, when a disturbance is the longest distance away. And then they spend the most time up in the air. And because they are as large as they are, there are real energetic costs to that kind of movement. Whereas willet, I showed that picture of them yelling at you. Willets seem to be sort of the jerks, the bird world. Like they're not going to like take off necessarily quite as quick. They're more likely to yell at you for a while. And so I think that that probably leads to some real important, effects in terms of how big the habitat patches are that whimbrel can occupy and how, influenced they are by things like disturbance. So those are the two hypotheses, but I have a new PhD student starting on this, so I'll tell you some more in a couple of years. Really good. No, it didn't. This was done in Colombia.
Yeah, so I think folks probably know that of all the shorebirds, as a group, curlews are the ones that have declined more than any other group of birds, right? Eskimo curlew, one of the most abundant birds in the world, gone. This is happening across the board. And so since you started it off on a couple questions that your lab looks at, why is it that curlews, do you think disturbance is the whole factor there, or what is it that makes curlews the group that decline the most?
Yeah, so I think there is definitely like some behavioral components to it, but I think the more important behavioral component for curlews is the fact that by and large, they do seem to be site faithful to these particular places in ways that, for instance, the godwits weren't. And so I think that there are sort of dynamics there to when you are looking for a particular spot and that spot starts to change. But that said, there have been sort of idiosyncratic reasons for so two species of curlews have gone extinct, not just the Eskimo curlew, also the slender-billed curlew in Europe was recently declared extinct. That one seems to have largely been a hunting-related issue. Eskimo curlews, certainly hunting was a component, but then there also seemed to be dynamics related to the collapse of agricultural insect communities during the 1930s and 40s, along with the first big burst of pesticides and then the Dust Bowl. So it is a little hard to pinpoint any one thing, but I do think that this sort of site faithfulness that all of the curlew species seem to exhibit during both migration and the non-breeding and breeding seasons may play a role, that other shorebird species just don't seem to be quite that tied to any one place. That's my guess.
Very good. Any more questions? No.
Scott Wiesenthal wrote an article about whimbrels, about an island where it's a hunting destination and people go there to shoot them for target practice.
Yes, there is that too.
Is that still going on?
It is to some degree. So it's not just one island. So many of the Caribbean islands, Barbados, the Grenadines, or Grenada, I should say, not drinks. Where is my mind? I'm already. Yeah, so these Caribbean islands are all places where hunting has become a pastime. And yes, especially targeting shorebirds. And because whimbrel are big and they're slower, they're often easier to shoot. So there has been a lot of progress on getting legislation to put hunting moratoriums on some of the species that have been most affected, like whimbrel, and most recently they have them now for greater and lesser yellowlegs as well. But of course, then there's always an enforcement issue. So it's a work in progress, but it is one where there is actually progress. But yeah, that has not helped them over the past few decades.
Very good. Well, on behalf of our Rochester Birding Organization, I'd like to thank you again for coming.
Thank you.
driving this way, I assume, yes, and coming here to speak with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you all.